All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good warm. Good. So I haven't seen you in 2 weeks. I see most of you have returned. I don't know. Are we having a pop quiz today?
No.
No. Good. We have 5 more classes, I think, regular scheduled classes, and then I'll do 1 makeup or 2 makeup sometime in July. I won't do a pop quiz during makeup time. We have 2 more pop quizzes, maybe 3. So you can probably expect 1 next week. Probably. Okay, good. If you have taken the pop quiz last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and haven't had it returned to you, I have some copies here. So please come up after class. Good. So has everybody been able to read the chapter 18 or 17, was it? The second half on politics? Yeah? Also, there was an article that I wanted you to read. An article that is online. It should be nippon.com, which has a lot of English articles. This one was by Matsuri Sensei, who's a professor here, about politics in the 90s and 2000s. So the link to that article is at the bottom of the notes. The notes I gave you in classes for lecture number 6. So today's 7. So if you go to 6 at the bottom of the notes, there's a link to an article. So please read that if you haven't read this week. Because that part of that will also be possibly included in the pop quiz. If I ask you to read anything, give you a reading, then you can expect I can take stuff out of it for the pop quiz. Okay, good. So last week, I was away last week. I hope you had a good vacation. We talked about the lost decades, right? What did we talk about? What were the things that we discussed in terms of things lost? Help me out. What sort of things were lost between the 1990s and 2008 or 9? Or said to be lost? What sort of problems did we mention in Japan in this period? Yes?
Economic growth.
Economic growth slowed down. There was some growth. And actually, it wasn't always minus, right? It was plus 1, 2. In some periods, it was a bit higher than the rest of the period. But yes, steady economic growth. What other things were lost? Try to remember. Yes?
Birth rate.
Huh?
Birth rate.
The birth rate fell. Although the birth rate was already quite low to start out with, it fell further. And by, mid-2000s, 2007, 2008, the working population, so the people in the Japanese population that is working age, which I guess is between 18 and 65, started to shrink. And now the actual population, the total population, including working age and all people, starting to shrink in Japan. This is a period in which population loss begins. What else did we say got lost? Yes? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Education.
Education. How could you lose education?
Because some people are going to really good, private school,
Right.
whereas some people have to go to public school and public school collapse.
Okay, well, education is equality in terms of opportunities, and also maybe equality in terms of achievement in education. It's been kind of diverging. Very good. That connects to a broader theme, a broader trend, which is a loss of general equality. Income equality, opportunity equality, job security equality. It wasn't that Japan was paradise between 1990 and everybody was equal, but there was generally bit less inequality in terms of job security and job income inequality. And this grows. We saw the Gini coefficient, Gini Keisu growth in Japan. This is not just Japan, it's all over the world. Most countries have this problem. What else? These are tangible things like the economy, the birth rate, opportunities in education, opportunities in job security. What other things? Yes, sir.
Another sense of
secure society.
The sense of a secure society, yes. This is a bit different. This is perception. So feeling. It's very hard to measure a feeling, right? How do you measure feeling across the country? This country feels happy, this country feels sad. You can't really do that. But if you do a regular opinion poll, 여론조사, more and more people are saying they're worried about the future or concerned about future security. There are many kinds of 여론조사, many kinds of polls, and not all of them point to pessimistic data. Some argue that people today, or at least younger people today, are generally more satisfied with life, although they're worried about the future compared to young people, say, in the 1970s or 60s. So it's very tricky to argue in terms of perception, but one could say that in general, there's a sense of less security, less hope, optimism. This is a very general statement. Good. Anything else, maybe? Yes?
Loss of moral. Which is like kind of like
Louder.
loss of moral.
Loss of moral. Wow, that's a big one. What's the moral?
Well, they kind of blame like maybe consumerism and then like younger people. We talked about the high
Consumerism, yeah.
Yeah, like high school girls are like selling themselves.
High school girls prostituting themselves, yes.
Yeah.
And Jokosai, what else?
Like gruesome murder.
Murder cases. Okay. There's a general image. But I think in all societies, in all times, people say the world is going to, all the morals are getting worse and worse. Young people are badly behaved. They don't work enough. I think if you go to every period in history, I'm sure in Heian Kyoto, the older generation was talking about the younger generation as being lacking in morals or respect or tradition. It is a universal thing, I think, generally. But one could argue that. Yes, sir.
The aging of the population and lack of social security.
Good. Well, we just mentioned that, but yeah, to capture in a general phrase, in two phrases, aging population, reduced birth rate, and sense of security, which is very true. Less and less younger people, less and less working age. So, and these trends continuing. It hasn't stopped, generally speaking. Other trends, maybe question of optimism or pessimism, very tricky question, a bit hard to pinpoint, but in the period that we talk about next week, there seems to be a bit more optimism and a bit more hope. I don't know. Anyhow, there are all these losses, material losses and also psychological or perceptual losses. We haven't talked about what was happening in the world of politics. So what exactly was going on in the political world in terms of elections and in terms of leadership, in terms of governance? And one could say that this was also a period of loss in the world of politics. What exactly do you think, or what do you think, what could you say was lost in terms of the world of politics in Japan in the 1990s? And for whom? Yes?
Well, there was a high rate of turnover in prime ministers.
High rate of turnover. What's turnover?
Like prime ministers kept on resigning, and then you went to in place.
There's a lot of change, and what prime minister comes to power, 1 year later he's gone, resigning or election, and then a new prime minister. Turnover. So what is that? A loss of?
I would say there's been a loss of opportunities to actually make meaningful change.
Yeah, possibly, indirectly, because governments change so often, and the prime minister changes so often, one doesn't get stability. So there's a loss of stability and loss of long-term policy implementation, possibly. Compared to, in the book they talk about it, the prime minister from 1955 to 1993, there were average year, 3.5 years prime ministers were in power. But after the mid-90s to about 2009, prime ministers had only 1 year or 1.5 years, changing all the time. So there's a clear loss of stability. More specifically, how did we talk about the period of the 1950s to the 90s in terms of the political system in Japan? How can we best describe this period?
One party system.
One and a half party system and dominated controlled by the LDP. Jiminto is very strong, right? It's a one-party system almost, one and a half. Opposition can never really come to power. So, in 1993, what happens?
The LDP lost its
Yeah.
election.
LDP does not have a majority in the lower house, so it has to step down, and an 8-party coalition government comes to power. So this is a loss of LDP dominance, an end to the 1955 system. It's called the 1950 55 体制 because it starts in 1955. But the LDP controls very skillfully. Of course, there's a lot of fighting inside the LDP between the Habatsu. In terms of who controls the government, it's the LDP, and they have very good relationship with whom? The LDP has good relationship with industry, big business, and the triangle, rural areas, yes, the steel and rice coalition, but also who? The politicians, the businesses, and bureaucracy, so-called Iron Triangle. And this was possible because, in part, because the LDP was very strong. So one could rely on the LDP coming to power, and one could depend on them, and one would want to continue a good relationship. But after 1993, this becomes not very stable. LDP becomes unstable. Although we'll talk about how it comes back to power, it's no longer dominant. What does dominant mean? It means you're unchallenged. You're very powerful. It becomes shaky. Okay. And moreover, there's a change in attitudes and policy towards bureaucracy. There are a lot of scandals around this period, and the bureaucracy becomes a target of attack. Okay? The politicians attack the bureaucrats, attack as in criticize and campaign and say, we are going to get rid of these corrupt bureaucrats, we're going to do political control. The bureaucrats are not listening to us. So kanryo bashing starts in the mid-90s. Accelerates it under Koizumi. And then you see that with Hashimoto Toru and all these guys. It goes all over Japan. So this stable relationship between the bureaucracy and then the politicians and industry too, there's a shift. All these things are happening. So there's a loss of the 55 system, dominated by the LDP, supported by the rural areas and the businesses and the bureaucrats. It starts to become all unraveled. Was this a good thing or bad thing? Not clear. Well, the main theme of today's lecture is to show you that although there are a lot of things lost and all things changing, there was a lot of effort. There was a conscious effort to change Japanese politics. People were unhappy. People are always unhappy with politics, but particularly unhappy in the 80s and 90s, and they wanted to change it and make Japan a better country in terms of its political system, as Matsura article talks about. And they made a conscious effort to reform Seiji Court, Seiji Seigo Court. They tried to reform and change the rules to make it more effective. Why it didn't work out? Well, we can talk about it a little bit. Okay, let's go to the slides, if I may. We already talked about this. What kind of period is between 1990 and 2010 in politics? It was the loss and collapse of the LDP, and then reborn in different form. Changes in political system. Volatility means instability and short-term governments. Creation of a two-party system? Question mark. A lot of this period was starting from 1995 to 2009. There was a hope and goal that Japan will have a competitive two-party system. Competitive means one party wins, the other party, in the next election, the other party wins. And there's a change of government. A bit like idealized version of British politics or American politics. Although American politics has the president, so it becomes a bit complicated. The idea is not one party winning all the time. You change. This was what they wanted to achieve. It happened in 2009, but the two-party system was not really two-party effective, stable two-party. So we'll talk about what role politics played a little bit and how it generated the kind of losses we talked about last week. Okay? A lot of the changes that we had 2 weeks ago, losses, some of them are just natural trends, but many of them were made worse by political situation or lack of political leadership or decisions taken. So we'll try to figure out. It's very complicated, as always, interaction between politics and society and economy, on the other hand, in this period. Okay, so I have five parts to this lecture. We'll start with the first part. In the end of the 80s, or even earlier, there were a lot of scandals, corruption scandals. Okay? There has always been periodic scandals in the 70s and 60s and 50s even, but in the 80s, the scandals seemed to be very, very, take an effect, damaging to public support of parties. And they involved not just one or two individuals, but the whole class, the political class and bureaucracy. And money scandals, sex scandals, all these sort of problems involving politicians and bureaucrats. The Kruger scandal, which was in the end of the 80s, one major one, 1988. For example, 90 Diet members had received shares, non-traded shares, before the company went public, and they made lots of money this way. Okay? And top politicians like Nakasone and Takeshita, who were prime ministers, were involved. And this caused a lot of unhappiness. And in the context of this period, this is just one scandal. There are many other ones. Sagawa Cuban scandal, for example, 1990. This period, of course, we talked about in the 80s, was the bubble period, and property prices were going up, and average people were suffering because they couldn't buy houses. And this fact that there's all this corruption and scandals involving money and whining and dining, it angered the public because the public felt, there was a lot of stress at this time. Despite a booming economy, people couldn't buy houses, land prices were soaring. So there was a kind of combination. And at the same time, politicians introduced consumption tax, 1989. This further weakened. This was a badly timed move, right after a series of scandals and then consumption tax. So there was a lot of tension and criticism towards the political class. Right. And there's also within the political class, inside the LDP, there was other parties. There was a lot of unhappiness about the political system. The main criticism was that Japanese politics was indecisive. They couldn't decide things, and it was very immobile, and it had a problem of dealing with crises. Okay, and there was a lot of concern that Japan was not a normal country. This is Ozawa wanted. Ozawa Ichiro, which we sometimes hear about. He felt that Japan was not a normal country. Why was it not normal? Well, because it didn't have its own military or autonomous military. It had to depend on the U.S. And a lot of decision-making, it depended on U.S. pressure, mainly, to change. So it felt like Japanese politicians couldn't act. For example, trade policy, or we talked about 1985, the Plaza Accord. This wasn't really because Japanese politicians acted independently, or bureaucrats acted independently. It was more pressure from the outside, and then they changed. So a lack of decisiveness, lack of autonomy. Another good example was in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. What was the first Gulf War? Between who and who? Which countries fought in the first Gulf War? The Ichiwangan Senso. Who knows? Anybody? This was before you were born, I guess. Yes? Iraq. And the coalition of willing, so the US mainly, UK, Japan as well, other Western countries. What did Iraq do? Iraq invaded Kuwait, right? And the goal was to push Iraq out of Kuwait, 1991, 92. When the Gulf War started, the US asked for help. Please send us equipment, please send us troops if you can, please send us money, but it took a very long time to respond. Several weeks, months passed. And the Japanese politicians were discussing what to do without making a decision. And when they finally decided, very late, that they're going to give lots of money, they ended up giving the most money to support the Iraq War or to support the US fight Iraq. They didn't get any thanks. They were criticized as being slow and being too late, too slow, too little. Well, actually, they paid a lot of money. There was expectation. Japan was the second largest economy at the time. They had succeeded throughout the Cold War to become better, bigger, and more successful. And now there was pressure on Japan to be more actively involved in international affairs and to take a leading role. But they couldn't because of internal factionalism, lack of a strong opposition, all sorts of problems. Okay? So this was one reason. One example given by Ozawa, who was one of the leaders who wanted to reform Japanese politics, that Japan is being too indecisive. There are also other things. He writes a lot about in this book. It's very interesting to understand today, to read this book that was written in 1990. He talks about the problem of too much regulation. The government is too big, the government is regulating too much, particularly in relation to local governments and regions. The central bureaucracy in Japan is too controlling of the local governments. Okay? So we need to do decentralization, Shogungan. And this starts in the 90s. So the idea of too much regulation, too much control, and lack of decisiveness because of all these bureaucracies and factions having a say on things. There's not one centralized leadership, and regions suffering from too much centralization. There was also a question of stagnation. Not only was Japanese politics indecisive, it doesn't seem to change. Well, what doesn't change? One party in power for so long. One party in power for 35, 38 years. People felt that this could cause what? What could happen if you have one person in charge for a very long time, or one government, one party? Corruption. Cozy ties between the bureaucracy and business. Okay? Lack of accountability. That is, because the government knows there's no opposition, realistic opposition, whatever they do, they'll win the next election. So why do we have to listen to the public? We'll listen to them a little bit, but not very seriously. That's what happens. When you're not worried that there's no competition, you relax. Same in any kind of market. There was people asking, is Japan really a democracy? Can it be a democracy if you don't have a change in government? I mean, the idea of democracy is that governments change and they're held accountable by being kicked out. You have the power to kick out the rascals. We never see this in Japan. There's also a lot of frustration towards the opposition that we will talk about a little bit. They were not realistic. They're perennial opposition. They're very, very ideological. They don't have a real program, alternate program to the LDP, especially in important policy areas like what to do with Japan's economy or what to do with foreign relations. Anyway, not a realistic program. And corruption. So, Ozawa and reformers and people back in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, they said, what do we need to do to make Japan a better political system? And they focused on this thing called the electoral system. Okay, in another class I do, I talk about in more detail Senkyo-sei, the electoral system, executive system, the rules of elections, which is very important in a democracy. If you have a PR system, proportional representation, Daikyo, if you have Shosenkyo, single-member districts, if you have alternate vote system, a presidential, if you have a prime ministerial system, all these rules have a big impact. And what these guys thought was the problem right now is Japan has no competition or bad competition because it has this thing called an MMD, multi-member district. So Chusenkyo-sei, which is in one district you have, this is Hokkaido, obviously Hokkaido. Back before 1993 or 1995, you had 5 electoral districts in Hokkaido representing Hokkaido, and you send politicians to the lower house. In each of these districts, how many politicians did you get? Well, between 3 and 6. So this is where Sapporo is, right? I think. Is this where Sapporo is? Well, they have 6 politicians from the first district. Here they have 5, and here they have 4. In other words, multi-member district. This was the old system. What did this do? We haven't really talked about it. It talks about it a little bit in the article, I think. What happens when you have when you have many people elected in one district? You understand this concept? As opposed to one person coming from one district. Okay? This is how it changed. Has anybody studied this before? What difference do you think will happen if you have a district, 5 or 6 districts with 4 or 5 people from each district, as opposed to say 25 single-member districts?
Factions arise inside the party
Why do factions arise inside the party?
because you have several positions, so you can have several candidates from the same party.
Very good. Because if you want to win power, you need to have half the seats. Let's say you have 500 seats, you have to have 250 plus, right? If you only stand one person, let's say you're the party A. If you only have one person from each of the districts, you only get 5 seats out of, say, 25. That's not enough. You need to win at least half of each of the districts. You need to have at least 2 or 3 seats from each district. This means that you have, party A has 4 or 3 candidates in the same district, in the same area. In Sapporo area, or what, I don't know, let's say around the Sapporo area, you have 3 or 4 people of the same party competing for the same number of seats. This leads to a lot of very strange dynamics. In a single member district, Party A will only have one person, right? One candidate. Party B will have one candidate. Party C will have one candidate. Because only one person can win. If Party A has 2 candidates, what happens in a single member district? What will happen? The vote will be split. Tomodaore. Okay? Hyobae. Tomodaore. So in single member district, you only usually, most likely, you only have one candidate. But in a multi-member district, you have multiple candidates. This means that the party has to, individual candidates compete with the same party members. So they can't just talk about, oh, my party is great. I'm from party A. I have a great leader. You have to differentiate yourself. You say, I'm from party A, but also, I graduated from Kyodai. I also know this and this person. I promise to bring lots of goodies. I'll build a bridge here. I'll build a station here. Make all kinds of personal, localized promises. So it becomes less a question about party competition. It becomes a question about personal competition. And this eventually is what you mentioned, factionalism. We have different factions, each faction supporting one of the candidates in the same district. You have 5 seats, maybe you have 3 different factions backing 3 different candidates. So this creates competition within the party locally and also nationally, and it creates disunity. It also costs a lot of money to compete, because you need to not only say I'm from party A, you have to provide personal attraction, you have to incentives to get people to vote for you personally. So you have to spend a lot of money on making a koenkai, which is a private campaign organization. All these things, okay? I won't go into so much detail. Anyway, they felt that this was the problem. This was the reason why, problem and also benefit. The LDP was very successful in creating and winning electoral districts, multi-member districts. But it also created factionalism. It also created very expensive and, because expensive, corrupt elections. And it also weakened the smaller parties. Okay? And it also fragmented. If you have a 5-member district, maybe, let's say there's 5 people from Goku, 2 will be from LDP, or 3 will be from LDP, 1 will be from JSP, Socialist, and the other will be from Komeito or Kyosanto. So you have 1.5, basically. One party dominant and then smaller fragmented parties. And because smaller parties, with only 15% of the vote, can get a seat, there's no incentive to come together and become a big party. They changed it and made it into single-member districts, each of them one person coming from each of the districts. What does this do? Well, it gets rid of competition within the party at the district level. And what happens to the opposition parties? Let's say there are 3 opposition parties, each with 1 seat, and then the LDP with 2 or 3 seats. When it becomes a single-member district, what do the smaller opposition parties do? There's only one winner in the district. It's either the LDP or one of the 3 small parties? No. The 3 smaller parties don't have enough votes, so what do? Yes, they come together. When you have a single-member district, only one winner, the weak people come together and become a bigger party. That's the logic. Okay? That's why Shōsenkyoku is supposed to equal Nidai Seitōsen. Single-member district is supposed to equal 2-party system. Did everybody know this before I talked about this? Raise your hand if you've heard this. Good. It's a very standard political science argument. And more or less it's true. Which countries have 2-party system?
Yes.
US?
UK.
UK? Well, kinda. Now it's become more. It was like 5-6-party system last election, yeah. US, UK, huh? Israel?
Australia.
Australia, very good. Canada, kind of. France, kind of. Where else? New Zealand before 1993. All these countries have single-member districts. You only have one winner in each district, so you tend to have 2 parties. The Japanese reformers thought, let's try and make Japan more into British-style politics. Ideal. Westminster. Where's Westminster? Who's been to Westminster? Where's Westminster? Huh?
London.
London, yes. Westminster Bridge. There was a terrorist attack recently, right? That's where the Diet is, or the Parliament. Okay. So when you say Westminster system, it's referring to an ideal version of British politics. We have 2 parties. What else about British politics? You have a very strong prime minister. You have centralized parties. Elections are fought. They're fought over policy, manifesto, not your personal quality. The candidates in the local districts don't say, I'm graduate from Kyodai, I'm going to bring a lot of money to your district. I have very good connection with the Minister of Construction. They don't make koenkai. No, they stand on the party manifesto and the leader. No, I'm with Corbyn, Labour Corbyn, and this is his manifesto. This is our manifesto, and this is good for Britain as a whole, not for just this district. Anyway, they wanted to make this kind of Westminster style. 2-party competition, was a change of government, top-down leadership, strong prime minister, PM is prime minister, more decisive, responsive government. Because power is centralized in the leadership, prime minister, you're decisive. You can act quickly. There are very few points of resistance against a British prime minister. It's much stronger than a president. People think, United States president is powerful. He's powerful in the sense that he controls the largest military in the world and the biggest country in the world. But there's a lot of blocks, right? The Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the local governments, very divided power. But in UK, who has almost all power? Prime Minister. There's very weak Supreme Court. There's very weak upper house. There's very weak local governments. So there was a vision to make Japan like UK. So they got rid of this. And how to become like UK? Well, main thing they thought was to change the electoral system, as I said. And to create 2-party, centralized leadership, reduce factions, fight corruption. So they did this reform. Electoral system, this is a bit details, this is how they changed it. The upper house wasn't changed as much. This is one of the problems. So this wasn't very important. This electoral system reform, Senkyo Seido Kaiga, happened in 1995. Okay, so this is sort of like the main changing point in Japanese politics. A lot of people argue. so many things change. Because you change the electoral system, you change how the parties compete, you change how the parties are organized, you change the power of the prime minister, you change how politicians connect with the voters. There are other reforms, political reforms. One was to make the prime minister and ministers much more stronger. Okay? Shocho Kaikaku, I guess. They reduced the number of ministries to 23, Shocho Saihen, to 12. They also created a cabinet office to better control bureaucracy, top-down political leadership. And they gave more powers and flexibility to the prime minister in terms of making his own policy. Okay? Until now, the prime minister was basically just the figurehead, stamping laws that were already decided by the elders in the LDP, the factions. But after this reform, the factions got weaker, and party leadership strengthened, the prime minister strengthened, and also in the structure of government, leadership was more concentrated under the prime minister. At the same time, there was another reform that we'll talk about in another class, which started in 1995. This was decentralization, Chiho Bunken. Chiho Bunken decentralization talked a lot about in Japan from the 1960s, 70s. But serious reform started in 1995. And the idea was to make local governments bigger, by merger. So the towns and villages become bigger. Maybe you come from a town or village that was merged. And by making it bigger, after making it bigger, you give more power and more freedom to local governments. And the idea was to reduce the work that the central government did and reduce the amount of money, actually, that was made, that the central government had to provide to local governments and make local governments more efficient and more capable, and let them compete with each other. Local governments compete with each other, and that will generate new innovation in policy and even improve public services. It'll get the public interested in local democracy, more participation. That was the dream idea. Did it pan out? Well, we'll talk about it a bit more in the other class, but it wasn't quite so effective. But, okay, so changing the electoral system, strengthening prime minister and control over bureaucrats, and decentralizing, giving more power to local governments. These are policies that are going against each other. They're contradictory. Why? Because one concentrates power and makes government more decisive. The other one distributes power and creates points of resistance. Okay? So, did they think about this carefully? No, not really. Did it create problems? Yes, definitely. Another thing that they didn't think about was the upper house. Japan has an upper house. It's a very powerful upper house. Compared to other countries. Italy also has a very powerful upper house, which they've tried to change as well. In the Westminster system, upper house usually is very weak. They're ceremonial. But Japan's upper house is very powerful, so they can block the lower house. If you don't control the upper house and the lower house together, what do you get? Yes?
Instability. You have instability.
Instability. You get gridlock. Gridlock. Can't move. One side going this way, the other side going this way. Gridlock. Okay? Nejire. This is one thing that they didn't change in the 1990s. They left the upper house, same powers, just a little change in the electoral system. Creates problems. Okay, anyway, they still thought single member districts, we're gonna have elections like UK or a political system like UK. Another thing though we have to remember is Japan has now 480 seats, back then 475 seats, back then it was 500 something, 496. It's not all seats that are single member districts. Some of them are from PR, Hiredaiko. So it's a mixed system. They had to do this because they had to compromise with the smaller parties. who felt that if they have SMD, smaller parties will disappear. They'll merge into a bigger party. So smaller parties, Komeito, Kyosanto, Nishato, they demanded a PR system. So it's not a pure single member district. It's not a 100% district. This is another problem. It's a mixed system which creates incentives for both. Pressure to create a big party to join in, and for the smaller parties, incentive to stay without forming a big party. That's why you still have these small parties in Japan. Kyosanto, Misha, Shakai, Shamito, Komeito. In a pure SMD, they will disappear. Well, not disappear, but will be less, like in the UK. Okay? So that's a little bit of political science for you. So you have these reforms. So does it work? Does these reforms work? Well, let's just go through this period in more detail. What was actually going on in the world of elections and polls? Well, as I said, LDP was weakened considerably from all these scandals. Another thing that I didn't mention was the agricultural population is shrinking, continuing to shrink. They're getting older and older, more and more people going to live in the cities, so less votes. So they have to reduce the number of seats in the countryside, so there's less support, rural support for the LDP. A result of all of these contextual problems, in 1989 upper house election, LDP loses in the upper house. So this is before the 1993 loss. To Doi Takako, who's the Madonna of the JSP, the Socialist Party leader, was a lady at the time, like it is now, example. She's supposed to be Madonna. At the time, in the book, they talk about how Uno Sosuke, who was the prime minister, very short-lived prime minister, he had a sex scandal involving geisha or some kind of mistress, and it came out in the newspaper that he didn't pay her any money or pay her properly when she broke up. So all the women were pissed off at Uno Sosuke and LDP, voted for Doita. Well, not just that, but so LDP is weakening considerably. What kills it, at least the 55 system, is internal dissent. That is, reformers, young and active, vigorous LDP reformer, led by Ozawa Ichiro, he leaves the party. And he starts a new party, Shinshinto. And there's some new parties come into the scene. They're not left parties, they're conservative parties. They're center-right parties. So the collapse of LDP starts with the internal breakup, 1993. They have an election, Miyazaki calls it an election, LDP loses, and then we have the first non-LDP government for 8 months under Hosokawa Morihiro, colorful character, who's the governor of Kumamoto Prefecture, whose also ancestors were Tono-sama, were lords. But he only survives for a very short time. But within this 8 months, there's quite a lot of important reforms. One of them being the electoral system change that we talked about, and then decentralization reform starts. He resigns, and we have another election. And the LDP manages to convince the Socialist Party, the Japan Socialist Party, to form a coalition. LDP and the JSP, they were enemies, right? From 1955 to 1993. What happened? Why are they suddenly holding hands together? They were fighting each other, at least ideologically, over protecting the Constitution, status of the American forces in Japan, opposing all sorts of things, cozy ties with business, bureaucrats. But in 1994, you have Jiminto and Chakaito together. Why? Well, pragmatic reasons. One is that the Cold War ended, so it's seen as less of a division. There's no more of this ideological struggle. And also the JSP felt this was the last chance that they could ever win power, because they were shrinking and shrinking. and the LDP offered the prime minister a seat. Murayama Tomichi was given the prime minister's seat. He was a socialist, okay? Of course, this damages the Socialist Party tremendously. A lot of the supporters for the Socialist Party, they voted for the Socialist Party on principle because they believed this was the party protect the Constitution, protect Article 9, oppose U.S. bases in Japan, oppose war, fight against Keidara, and fight against these evil capitalists. But now they're together with LDP. It's very disappointing. So you can see, Socialist Party collapses and disappears basically after this merger. Okay. And you can see this. This is the Socialist Party coming down. 1990 support was at its peak. 1989 under Doi Takako, and then it's basically gone. In its place is this DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan, comes out of the mess in 1994-96. Some elements from the Socialist Party, some elements from Hosokawa's party, some elements from Ozawa's party, they come together in a coalition and become the new opposition. Center left, sometimes center right, but in opposition to the LDP. And they steadily gain. The LDP, you can see, this is the support rate, has come down since 1993 and has never really recovered. About 30 to 40%. Party support for the party, not support for the prime minister, which is a bit different. This is very interesting. What is this? What is non-partisan? You see from 1960s to 2009. Non-partisan. What's a non-partisan? What do you do if you're a non-partisan? A person who doesn't like parties? Boring person?
Independent,
Independent. What do you mean to be independent?
like they're not in the party, but they probably have still kind of ideologies.
Good. These are people who, when asked, do you support any party? They say, no, I don't support any party. But that doesn't mean you don't go to elections. You choose your party every election depending on whatever things are important for you. Okay? And used to be, well, quite high, but it's now gone up to 40-50%. Recent elections, 40-50%, even higher, say they don't support any party. The others, 30-40% supporting one party. These are not people who are members. They're not people who have paid money to the party and have a card saying I'm a member of the DPJ or LEP. To be a card-carrying member, so-called, is much less. 2, 3, 5% of the population. Sorry, that was not very precise figures, but LDP and DPJ combined all, I think, 2-3% of the population has come down considerably. This is not just Japan. All over the world, everybody doesn't like parties or are not loyal. If you ask somebody in the 60s and 70s in most Western democracies, most people will say, yeah, I support the Labour Party or I support the Conservatives. The majority had some party affiliation. What's happening? Well, there's a distancing between the general public and parties. Which is all very interesting dynamic. What happens is, what this creates is a lot of instability because there are a lot of people who are floating votes. They can move this way or that. They're not tied into the party through various interest groups. Right? They're no longer beholden to a party because they work for this industry or because they're farmers or because they work for, I don't know, the postal services. You're going to support the LDP no matter what. Those will become fewer and fewer. There's less attraction to parties, stable. Right. Okay. In this environment, you have, after the DPJ, after Murayama Toichi for 3 years, doesn't do very much, but you have lots and lots of instability. LDP wins majority and strengthens their majority, but prime ministers continually change. between 1989 and 2001, 11 prime ministers. Some prime ministers as short as 2 months. This is Koizumi Mori and Hashimoto Ryuichiro. And during this time, we saw the Economist cover, right? Leaderless Japan. Japan has drifting, no leadership. These kind of criticisms become very common. Just very quickly, this is one of the first prime minister after Murayama, Hashimoto Ryutaro. He does focus on more reform, including strengthening the prime minister's office, reorganizing ministries, financial big bang. But he, of course, stumbles. He loses an election because he raises the consumption tax to 5%, from 3% to 5%. That's very low. In a lot of European countries, consumption tax is what, 10, 12, 14%. Anyhow, it's a killer. He loses in upper house elections. The next prime minister is Oguchi-san, who's famous for pizza. Why is he famous for pizza? Anybody read? C, because he likes pizza? A, or he makes pizza? C, or he's like pizza. He appears like pizza. Anybody? This was the most fun part of the textbook, the politician compared to pizza. Come on, kids. Well, he was called cold pizza because all the factions have different leaders, and when they were trying to decide the next prime minister after Hashimoto, the faction leaders couldn't agree on who to put as a prime minister. So the leftover, the remaining, the cold pizza was Uchi-san, and they decided, let's use Uchi-san, although he's a bit sort of not really hot. Anyway, he was very clever, I think. Not that I met him personally, but he decided to have a press conference to the foreign press. I was a New York Times article that he was referred to as cold pizza, and he served pizza to the foreign reporters, and he made a joke saying, pizza cold is actually quite tasty. Don't worry about me. Oh, nobody's laughing. Do you understand the joke? Hard. Okay, anyway, what did he do? Well, it was unfortunate because he died while in office with a stroke. His daughter, Obuchi Yuko, took over, but he tried to do different things, banking reform, administrative reform. He also tried to speed up the economy by increasing public works, by spending a lot of money. He did a kind of pump priming. And he was, Japan's national debt was going up and up, and he said, it's okay, I'm the king of debt. It's great having lots of debt. You're spreading it around. This will accelerate the economy. He also had some very interesting ideas together with a commission, such as how to reform Japan. There's a sense that Japan was so stagnant and unchanging. One of the goals was to make English the national language. Some plan in 1998. Shocking stuff, but very interesting, right? Or to, step up things like immigration, step up things like gender equality. Very progressive for LDP. Okay, the next prime minister was very regressive in a sense because he was very traditional, very conservative, very male patriarchy kind of guy. This is Mori. He came to power with an alliance with the Buddhist party. So LDP was not strong enough to control power by itself. It could stay in power by making a coalition with Komeito. This is also a bit of a shocking kind of coalition because Komeito traditionally was supported by people who are not the beneficiaries of LDP government or LDP policy. Pragmatic marriage. In any case, he had lots of problems. He said things like "Nihon wa tenno o chushin to shita kami no kuni," which today might not be so shocking, but back then it was very, very conservative. He's saying Japan is the land of gods, and Shinto is its main religion, basically. He had women scandals, and his support rate came down to 10%, 8%. So they had to get rid of him. LDP loses quite badly. I mean, they still maintain government control thanks to coalition with Komeito, but obviously they need to change. And LDP is seen as this dinosaur, undying dinosaur that has come back and staying on and on and on. So, well, that's the way some people feel today about today's government. But they decided to change face and image. And new guy, Koizumi Junichiro. Who knows Koizumi? Who has heard of Koizumi Junichiro? Good. These people have not heard of Koizumi Junichiro. I cannot believe it. You guys are not listening, or you're not paying attention, or you don't care. Okay. He's a weirdo. His image is weirdo. I think he was really a weirdo. He had a very charismatic style, charismatic hair. His nickname was Lionheart. I don't know, because of lion-like hair. He did a lot of, not SNS. Back then there was no Facebook. Back then there was no SNS. He had a Mail magazine. You already heard of Mail magazine? No. This was a primitive kind of Facebook, or primitive kind of SNS. You send letters to mail addresses. Okay, so it's kind of one way. But he had a very large following, mainly of housewives, who loved him because he's so much more handsome than Mori, I guess. When he sent, I'm just being facetious, but sending mail messages every day, once a day, once 2 days, saying this is what I do, this is what I'm trying to get done in Japan. So direct link to the public. He's very good at linking directly, political message, not just political message, just a message, by exposure to the general media. Nowadays it's Twitter, right? Or nowadays it's, this was kind of primitive Twitter, by using email addresses. You sign up, and then you get magazines. What else? Fan of opera, Elvis Presley, and X Japan. This might be in the quiz. I might ask what band Koizumi liked. You have to answer either Elvis Presley or X Japan. You know X Japan? Who knows X Japan? Okay. More than Koizumi. He's more important though. But, media savvy. Media savvy. What's savvy? What does it mean if you're media savvy?
He's good at using.
Yeah, so you're good at it. You're skilled. Very. You know how to control the media. Huh? It's a bit like Hashimoto Toru when he was very popular. You know how to make a message to the people through TV, short interviews, Twitter. He did all these things. He started it basically. Support rate is very high and stays high. Very, very, very unique as a prime minister. Usually you have a honeymoon period, boom, goes down, but he maintained very strong stability. In a sense, a bit like Abe. Abe number 2, Abe 2. And what his very interesting was that he stood on a platform. What did he promise to do? Well, the main message to the public was, I'm going to destroy the LDP. I'm going to change the LDP. I'm an LDP leader, but I'm going to change the old ways of the LDP. I'm going to destroy old Japan, destroy old LDP, and everything's going to be new and reformed and improved and efficient. It's the same, and there's no area untouchable. Seiki Naki Kozo Peka. Okay? You can see that this Koizumi support rate. Here, Koizumi, Katoyama, Hosokawa, Abe, number 1. Uda Aso, very bad. Only within a year. Okay, that's Koizumi. He's saying, we need reform. That was the main message. Reform. Reform of what? It wasn't quite clear. And how is it a reform? But basically saying reform. We're the party of reform. If you look into the contents of the reform, they're essentially neoliberal. What is neoliberal? It is when you distrust government, when you think that things work better with market forces rather than government control. So you want to shrink the government and expand the market in all kinds of all kinds of economic and social spheres. The deregulation, what is that? To reduce laws and regulation of markets. You reduce regulation of licenses for selling alcohol, for example. Or you change the labor laws, so that until now, manufacturing jobs, you couldn't be a haken rodosha to do manufacturing. After you change it, all kinds of jobs could be contract labor, all kinds of reform. Privatization, kind of a similar idea. Essentially, what was formerly done by government or companies owned by government, railways or postal services, universities, even, you privatize. The government no longer owns it, and the management is run privately. And it could be, publicly owned company. It's a private company that has shares. So all kinds of reforms. Another key point of his policies was, let's make society and local governments less dependent on central government. So we talked about the Steel and Rice Coalition, where the LP governments gave a lot of money and subsidies through public works, building, construction in the rural areas. And they got votes that way. He stopped that. He cut it very much. He reduced he reduced public works dramatically. This is part of privatization and reducing government. So the links, Koizumi was very unliked in rural Japan because he did all these things. Also top-down decision-making, breaking factions in LDP. So all the kind of reforms in terms of centralizing power in the prime minister started to appear under Koizumi. One thing to remember with Koizumi, he was very lucky. Why? Well, partly because the LDP controlled the upper house between 2001 and 2006. So they had power. There was no challenge from the upper house. So he could do a lot of these changes without being challenged. Well, actually, he was challenged a number of times, most significantly when he tried to privatize the post office. Then the upper house said no, because the upper house is full of rural politicians. When you privatize post office, it hurts post office related jobs, of course, but it hurts the rural areas most. And the rural communities depend very much on postal services, and also the postal services has a bank. There's a postal bank section, which is very, very rich, has lots and lots of assets. And in Japan, the postal services, which is owned by the central government, the money that you save in the postal services, where does it go? It's spent on public works. It's spent on all kinds of national projects. Koizumi wanted to stop that money from going to the public sector by privatizing the public postal service and privatizing the postal bank. Okay. Who suffers most? The rural areas. So the rural areas resisted. Kamei, Shizuka, Hiroshima, all these different politicians stood up and said, no, we're going to fight you. So LDP broke apart, but the Koizumi very successfully defeated them. Okay? There's a little bit of that in the textbook. Anyway, he did things top down, regardless of resistance from rural LDP people, resistance from within. He used his charisma, he used his popular support and ratings to push through reform. He also used outside advisors. For example, in his cabinet, he had an economist from Keio University, Takenaka Heizo, who was one of the driving engines for these neoliberal reforms. A lot of people who don't like neoliberal reforms point to Koizumi and Takenaka as the evil pair of the simplicity. Okay. That's Koizumi with Bush. He did lots of major reforms, including fiscal decentralization, privatization of postal service and postal bank, deregulating labor market, which I talked about. He cemented ties with the U.S., supported the U.S. after 9/11, 2001 attacks, terrorist attacks. In the war against terror, Japan was much more actively involved, sending troops, peacekeeping operations. And he also visits Yasukuni Shrine 6 times, which of course was very unhappy for China and Korea, and relationship with Asia was very badly damaged. Although Japan was benefiting very much from trade with China at the time. China was becoming bigger and bigger. 2002 to 2006, Koizumi economy grew. A lot of that thanks to China trade. Anyway, political tensions were very bad. So you had warm economics, cold politics. Okay. Despite a lot of this drama and spectacle, if you look after Koizumi steps down, a lot of the reforms were backtracked or they were watered down. So Koizumi, though seemingly all powerful, seems like he's top down doing everything. Actually, not all his policy areas were 100% achieved. Oftentimes they were reversed after he left. So it shows how important this one, the power of the prime minister is actually. If you have somebody who's very strong and charismatic, has a lot of support, can do a lot. But once that office is vacated, and somebody who's less popular, reforms could be reversed. He's seen, however, in Japanese history as a very important prime minister, very powerful, top-down leadership, as a kind of result of all the reforms that took place that I talked about in 1995, electoral reform, and then under Hashimoto, reform of the prime minister's role and the cabinet. And populism. He's like, if you talk about populism, and you talk about Koizumi, what is populism? Very difficult question. Somebody give me an answer. Give me an example of a populist. Yes, ma'am.
Me?
Yes, you.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. Okay, good. Who else? Who is a populist?
Abe.
Abe, yes. Okay. Who else is a populist? How about in Osaka? I keep on mentioning. Hashimoto Toru is populist, right? Have you ever heard of the term populist? 日本語ではポピュリストと言いますが、日本語の言葉はあんまない。Yeah.
It's difficult because any politician is populist.
Exactly. Any populist. If you appeal to the people, populo is the people, right? That makes you a populist.
Well, that's
Simple. Yeah.
What's the difference between populist and Taishu
One is English, the other Japanese. No. Yeah, Taishu Geigo is the idea, basically. That you appeal to the public.
What's used differently in populist?
Oh, really? In Japanese? I don't know. That's a very good question. The point that you made just now, that most all politicians are populists, is true. Because all politicians, if you want to win an election, you have to appeal to the general public. But what separates populists from regular politicians, the argument is, if you're a populist, you attack another group, a certain group. And you say, this group is not the real people, and I represent the real people. So Trump, who does he attack? Who does Trump always, in the elections, who was he attacking? Huh? The establishment, the elite in Washington, the big parties. He's an outsider. The liberal elite in New York, in Washington, in California. Right? And they're not the real Americans. I represent the real Americans who are the white people, the working class people, the honest businessmen. I don't know. The others, the immigrants, or the illegal immigrants, they're not Americans. The liberal elite, they're not real Americans. Homosexuals, they're not real. Well, he wasn't so hard on homosexuals, but. So a populist, Hashimoto, yeah. Yes, populism is always closely linked to nationalism, because it's the definition of who is the real people. And you're only the real person if you are a true American, patriotic American. Right? Yeah, Le Pen in France. Are you from France? Yeah, Le Pen is a pure populist nationalist. Combining, appealing to the people by saying, I represent you and you are the real people, and the real people are the pure French, who can speak French language, who has a She tried to avoid being racist, but actually there's a lot of racist undertone. Hashimoto Toru, yeah, someone.
So we can say populism can be all kind of shape.
Yeah.
But not always all the populist.
Not all populists are nationalists. Good. There's another type of populism. Koizumi populism wasn't so nationalistic. A little bit. Abe populism is clearly nationalistic. What was Koizumi attacking? Foreigners? No, not really. Who was he attacking? After you've seen these slides. Bureaucrats. He was attacking public sector. He was attacking inefficient bureaucrats. He was also attacking the LDP, the old LDP, the old style of politics. So this was not an appeal to nationalism, it was an appeal to bashing bureaucrats. Okay? So combined with Teishugeigo, but also Kanryo Hihan. That was Koizumi style populism, I would think. Same with Hashimoto Toru. His main thing was these damn local public servants who are not doing anything, who are not working, they're making so much money. We have to cut their salaries. They don't even stand up, well, that's kind of nationalism. Attacking local teachers, right? Public school teachers, attacking fu no shokuin, shi no shokuin, all these kind of things. There was an element of nationalism. But I think populism is very difficult to define, but one of the strong arguments I've heard is that they split the world into two. The real people and the not real people. And they attack the not real people. And they say, I represent the real people. And the other people, the other arguments, the other parties are wrong. There's no room for debate. They're just evil or wrong. A more reasonable liberal politician or party will accept opposition, will accept their other views, and try and come to a kind of discussion and debate, and also inclusive. Even if you don't support us, we will represent you because we believe the best interest of the country is this way, but we will take care of we will also understand the needs of the opposition. Anyway, here's Hashimoto. It says, Koizumi Junichi Okoira. Silly, this was when he was very popular. But the idea is this kind of brand of populism where you attack, and you attack using Twitter or mail, Facebook or whatever. Direct messages to the public. You separate yourself from the party. This started, I think it existed in some form before, but really took shape under Koizumi. And you have various other politicians. Kawakami Shicho in Nagoya, it's kind of populist. Abe the second. Well, it's an interesting trend, and it's not just Japan. People are unhappy about parties, right? People are dissatisfied with political parties, they don't trust them, so what they want is a kind of outsider figure who says, I stand apart from the parties, and I really represent the interests of everybody. And they want to find a scapegoat. So sometimes it's the bureaucrats, sometimes it's the liberal elite, other times it's foreigners. Well, Japan has so few foreigners, it's hard to bash them. We have 1% or 2%. If there are 10% foreigners, I'm sure these populists will be attacking foreigners. Okay. How much time do we have? Very good. Okay, so after Koizumi, you have many prime ministers, one per year. Aso, Fukuda, Abe. No, Abe, Aso, Abe, Fukuda, Aso, and then Hatoyama, Noda. So the order of the 6 prime ministers may be part of your quiz. May be part of your quiz. See? Not really popular, right? I don't know. It may be, maybe. Okay, what had happened? As I said, Koizumi had done these reforms, privatizing, decentralizing, fiscal decentralization, reducing public works, reducing government spending. All of these hurt the rural areas tremendously. And so the rural areas' traditional core support of LDP distanced itself from LDP. It was very unhappy. And one of the results was in 2007, the LDP lost dramatically and they lost to the DPJ, which had come together. They had started to form into a bigger party, and they're getting momentum. In part due to Koizumi excessive deregulation, excessive privatization, and a sense, a perception that Koizumi's reforms is making Japan a more unequal country and very painful for farming areas and rural areas. Very painful, difficult time for Hisei Kikoyo, dispatch workers, divisions in society. And there was some pension records crisis. Renki mondai, we won't go into details, but small crises here and there, and a sense that the LDP has relaxed again. They're back in power now for 10, 15 years, and they think that they're a natural party and they're not going to change. And again, as in 1990, end of 90s, a sense that we have to get rid of the LDP no matter what. We don't care whether the opposition is reasonable, we need to kick them out. DPG emerges as challenger. They do very well in the upper house. They get a lot of publicity and support from the media too, actually, in the beginning. And there's a kind of momentum. Ozawa, who was part of the LDP, who we talked about, who left the LDP in 1992 or 3, he's now leading the DPJ. He's one of the leaders of the DPJ. He had destroyed the old system, and now he's gone into many small parties, and now he's back around 2003, was it? He returns to the DPJ. They promise a lot of things. This is the 2009 election in which they win. They promise things about the pension system. Everybody's worried about pension making because the government had lost records of the pension. Who had paid, who had not paid, how much you had paid. Can you believe that? If you're told that you've been paying this much and suddenly you get a letter saying, we don't know how much you paid, sorry. Very, very big prices. It's like you go to the bank and the bank says, oh, I don't know where your money is. That's as bad as that. So it's a major crisis. They also promise things like giving more money to children, okay? Because they felt that the way to increase fertility and increase couples having children and to reduce inequality is to spread money around, not just to old people, not just to rural areas, but to families. And then they also appeal to farmers. Traditionally, the opposition parties were not really active in trying to reach out to rural areas. Why? Because the LDP is so strong there. But LDP was loosening space in rural areas, weakening, so opposition comes in and tries to capture votes there. Okay? And their manifesto is greater spending, so it's like a backlash against Koizumi and Kozo Kaikaku. It says we need to spend more, we need to spend wisely, we have to stop wasting money on concrete and useless projects, we need to spend more on education and child allowances and things that are useful. This was relatively popular, but I think more than DPJ's policies being popular, a lot of people were, I think their data saying that a lot of people were not so convinced that they could do this. But the LDP was so unpopular in 2008, 2009. Abe, first, he came into power 2006 to 2007. He sort of resigned suddenly because he had so he says he has a stomach problem, health problem. So back then, everybody made fun of him as having, he had to run to the bathroom all the time. So international conferences, he had to sit close to the exit so he can run to the bathroom whenever. Very different from Abe today, right? And then Aso of Fukuda also, he was very unpopular. He had a very, very bad relationship with the public and the press. He was seen as very arrogant and not very, not very popular anyway. And then Aso also was seen as this support rates were very low, all kinds of problems. So 2009, DPJ, they have a general election in August, and the LDP collapses, basically collapses. That is, they lose a lot of support across the board, not just in city areas where opposition party tends to be strong, but also in rural areas. the DPJ makes a lot of gains. And ministers and veteran LDP, people who have won elections over and over, they lose seats to young DPJ candidates, often women. So there's a seat change, 300 seats or something, very big majority, 320 seats or something. So finally, there's a sense that, oh, Japan is changing. There's hope now because DPJ is there, LDP is kicked out, people want change, people clamoring for change. And now Japan is finally a normal country, democratic, because change is going. Are they successful? Are they going to achieve what they promised? Well, we'll see next week. But essentially, DPJ has lots of problems, and then LDP comes through. So that's the end of the lecture. Next week, please read chapter 18 of the book. Okay? And as I said, there's a highly likelihood of some pop quiz. Who has my textbook? Does anybody have one? Anybody else? Okay, well, the person with the text will come up. If you haven't received your quiz, a correct quiz, the first quiz, come, I have it, I probably have it here. Otherwise, chapter 18, read your notes, okay? Next week I will give you your final term paper assignment. That is, I will explain what you need to do for your final paper, which is due end of July. 25, 26. It's a 2,000-word English essay. That's the main grade. Okay, if you have any questions, you can come up, but otherwise, enjoy your week.